Welcome to the January 23rd Enforcement and Compounding Committee meeting. My name is Maria Serpa, chairperson of the committee. Before we convene, I'd like to remind everyone present that the board is a consumer protection agency charged with administering and enforcing pharmacy law. Where protection of the public is inconsistent with other interests sought to be promoted, the protection of the public shall be paramount. This meeting is being conducted consistent with the provisions of Government Code Section 11133. Participants watching the webcast will only be able to observe the meeting. Anyone interested in participating in the meeting must join the WebEx meeting. Information and instructions are posted on our website. As I facilitate this meeting this morning, I will announce when we are accepting public comment. I've advised the meeting moderator to allot 3 minutes to each individual providing comments. This approach is necessary to facilitate the meeting and to assure committee has an opportunity to complete its necessary business. I would like to ask staff moderating the meeting to now provide a general instruction to members of the public participating via WebEx.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before we get started, I would like to remind committee members and senior staff who are not speaking to mute their microphone. If I detect background noise during the meeting as a result of unmuted microphones, I will interject with a brief friendly reminder or simply mute the microphones. To facilitate public comment, we will be utilizing the WebEx question and answer feature, also referred to as the Q&A panel. When the committee chair announces public comment is appropriate, public comment will be requested. Please note that the Q&A feature is being used only as a means for members of the public to represent that they would like to make a verbal comment. Once given permission to unmute, the member of the public may unmute themselves and verbally state their comment. The Q&A feature is not to be used for typing out questions or for committee members to communicate with one another. And with that, I return the floor to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I would now like to take a roll call to establish a quorum. Members, as I call your name, please remember to open your line. Jig Patel, he's not present. Renee Barker.
Licensee member present.
Thank you. Indira Cameron Banks, she's not present. Sung Oh.
I'm here.
Thank you. Ricardo Sanchez.
I'm here.
Thank you. Good morning, all. A quorum has been established. Members, as we begin today, I'd like to thank all of you and members of the public for all of your time and participation. I ask everyone participating today to be respectful of the work before the committee. We encourage participation by members of the public throughout our meeting at appropriate times. The committee respectfully requests that when comments are provided, they are done so in a professional manner consistent with how the board conducts its business. As included on the agenda today, the committee will begin its work to evaluate several USP chapters, focusing today on Chapter 825, Radiopharmaceuticals. I intend to dedicate the next several meetings to reviewing Chapters 795, 797, and 800, discussing the board's current regulations and evaluating what, if any, changes are appropriate to assure consumer protection. We will discuss this more in detail when we begin our discussion of Agenda Item 8. Let's start with public comment for items not on the agenda. I would like to remind members of the public that you are not required to identify yourself, but may do so. I would also like to remind everyone that the committee cannot take action on these items except to decide whether to place an item on a future agenda. Members, following public comment for this agenda item, I will ask you to comment on what, if any, items should be placed on a future agenda. As a reminder, this agenda item and the public comment is not meant to be a discussion, rather an opportunity for members of the committee and members of the public to request consideration for an item for future placement on the agenda. Moderator, we are ready for public comment for items that are not listed in the agenda.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have opened up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment on agenda item 2, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and submit it to all panelists. Or you may simply raise your hand. If you've accessed the meeting by calling in, you can raise your hand by pressing *3. We are displaying instructions and we'll give you a moment. Please remember that for the sake of time, you will have a 3-minute time limit. I will give you a 10-second warning. And I see our first request for public comment is from Lindsay Gulahorn. So Lindsay, you should be able to unmute yourself. There you go.
Good morning, Chair Serpa, board members. This is Lindsay Gulahorn with the California Retailers Association and the National Association of Chain Drugstores. I'd like to raise an issue that is not on today's agenda, but that CRA and NACDS feel is very important and time sensitive. The California state of emergency related to COVID-19 is ending at the end of February, on February 28th, 2023. And all related to Department of Consumer Affairs waivers end on that date as well, not including the Board of Pharmacy waivers that end at the end of May. The DCA waiver that allows pharmacy technicians to perform COVID immunizations and testing expires at the end of February. However, the Federal Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, the PrEP Act, allows pharmacy technicians to perform both of these tasks as well as flu vaccines, and the PrEP Act does not expire until October of 2024. So we would just respectfully ask for confirmation from the board as to whether the board recognizes the PrEP Act preemption and will continue to allow pharmacy technicians to continue to administer COVID tests and COVID and flu vaccines beyond the end of the California state of emergency. There are references to the PrEP Act in certain state documentation, including from the Department of Public Health. So we would just like clarification on that. And we understand that the board is pursuing a legislative proposal that would allow for expanded technician duties. But there is a significant period of time between the end of the state of emergency and when that bill, if introduced and passed, goes into effect. So we just want to ensure that technicians can continue to do these immunizations and testing until the PrEP Act expires. If that is the board's interpretation, feel like there would be a significant impact on access to these services. If not, so perhaps this could be added to a future board meeting, given that the state of emergency ends at the end of February, perhaps the February 6th Board of Pharmacy meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. This is the moderator. I see no further requests for public comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Having received public comment, I'd like to survey the members to determine what, if any, item they'd like to include on a future agenda. And just to, I guess, begin, the comment was really not for our committee, but if you do have a suggestion that could go to another committee or to the full board, our president is also here. Okay, thank you. Moving on, item number 3, approval of the October 22nd committee meeting minutes. Included in attachment 1 of the meeting materials is draft minutes for the committee's October 4th, 2022 meeting. Members, do you have any questions or comments on the draft minutes from October 4th? As a part of your comments, I would also entertain a motion if you believe such action is appropriate.
Sure, I make a motion to approve.
Thank you.
I'll second that, Ricardo.
Ricardo seconds. With the motion and second on the floor, I'll now open for discussion for public comment related to the minutes. Moderator, please open the lines.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've opened up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment on agenda item 3, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of the screen and submit it to all panelists, or simply raise your hand. If you've called in, you can press *3 to raise your hand. We'll give you a moment. All right, I see no requests for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
With the motion and second and public comment, opportunity for public comment received, I will now take a roll call vote. Renee Barker.
Approve.
Young O.
Yes.
Ricardo Sanchez.
Yeah, approve also.
Thank you. And the chair votes yes, motion passes. Thank you. Agenda item 4, discussion and consideration and possible action on self-assessment forms. I take a deep breath because this is very similar to a previous agenda item where things can get a little confusing. So please pay attention to the preliminary remarks. Members, the dynamic nature of pharmacy law generally results in the need to update self-assessment forms on an annual basis to incorporate law changes made either at the state or federal level. As included in the meeting materials, there are 4 self-assessments for our review. Staff is recommending action on only one of the self-assessment forms. 17M112 related to automated drug delivery systems is the one that staff is recommending that we take further action. It is recommended that the remainder of the forms be completed via a Section 100 regulation change as listed in the proposed materials. The changes to the forms themselves do not create a requirement, but rather include a new update or repealed legal requirement that licensees must follow. From a process standpoint, we should agree that with this approach moving forward, and the executive officer can move forward in updating these forms through the streamlined process. I support this approach and would offer that the chair of the committee review the proposed changes for future updates made via the Section 100 process. Members, I hope you had an opportunity to review the proposed changes for those 3 forms, and I'm in agreement with the staff recommendation that offered on the self-assessments. So the forms that we're looking at are community pharmacy / hospital outpatient self-assessment, hospital pharmacy self-assessment, and wholesaler / third-party logistics provider self-assessment. I would appreciate member comments on both the recommendation offered to use Section 100 process as a means to update these 3 forms, as well as the recommended changes to the forms themselves. So I think there's a slide that's coming up. You will note that the materials and the slide summarizes the changes on these forms in really small font, but it is in your meeting materials. So that is the community pharmacy outpatient. So those are the bullet points that are in our meeting materials if you wanted to review them. Do we have next slide?
Maria, I have a couple things. Or do
You want to do one at a time and then open them for public comment at once?
Yeah, probably. Mine is just one comment for all of them. So it's, well, a couple, but
If it's for all of them, let's can I show 2 more slides first?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. And then these were the changes that are highlighted in our meeting materials for hospital. And these are the changes for wholesaler and 3PL that are highlighted in our meeting materials. So the meeting materials have these bullet points, and then they have the addendum that has the specific self-assessment forms delineated out with the track changes on. Okay, Sung, thank you for, what's your comment on the 3?
Yeah, just on the community one, that's the only one that I saw something. So under 1.24, that's added on. It's not on the slides, but it's the part about the pharmacy temporarily closes. So 1.24 is new from our new regulation. When the pharmacy temporarily closes, the pharmacy must notify the board of the temporary closure. I am a little bit concerned that might just cause confusion for just regular pharmacists in charge and pharmacists, because we have a temporary pharmacy absence law. So I want to make sure that if we could, I think that this is something non-substantive that staff and council and you can work on. I just want to see if you guys could make it a little bit more clear that this means about the facilities closure, not pharmacists not being there. So, or pharmacies temporarily closed for lunch breaks. There's a little difference. So I want to make sure that people don't get confused about that, because there is a pharmacies close for temporary absence of a pharmacist. That happens every day in a lot of pharmacies in the state of California. So just wanted to add that comment. On the inventory reconciliation, which is section 22, under 22.3.7, an inventory reconciliation report must be prepared for any identified control loss no later than 3 months after discovery of the reportable loss. Again, that's just a very legal nuances there. I just want people to understand that just emphasize on the discovery of the reportable loss is emphasized somehow so that people can understand that it's for the not just all loss. And the loss also is a confusing concept for a lot of pharmacists. So I want to make sure pharmacists understand that this is just for the reportable loss. Also emphasizing 22.3.8 inventory activities, which activities is different from reconciliation. Also, we did leave 22.5 and 22, which I think is supposed to have been removed. 22.5, I think, is changed to 22.3.9, which are all non-substantive. I just wanted to, I think, could be argued that it's non-substantive, but just in case it's not, I just want to make sure I point that out so we could consolidate that. I think 22.5 was supposed to have been incorporated into 22.3.9 because both of them are not correct. It's not countersigned anymore. It's the statement confirming the accuracy is sufficient, which I think is reflected in the hospital one, just not on the community one. So that's it. Oh, and lastly, about the sections we're removing, I think those are still useful information. So hopefully we can leave those information on the website as a optional FYI for the blood products and I think it's remote dispensing site places. That's it.
Well, that's quite a bit for something that was supposed to be so small, but you have really good comments. I do appreciate that. On the 22.5, I do see where there is some duplicative information, and I can certainly work with staff and the executive officer to combine those two in some way. I think that's a valid point. I am not sure how we could provide the information on 27 and which is the blood product, and I thought the other one it's in here. As maybe as an FAQ, or I'm not quite sure what the needs are there. I think that it was specific to take out a lot of the details and have the references there to keep one of the comments that we get from members of the public is that a lot of these don't apply to everyone.
Right. Are there a lot of businesses? I mean, how many, I guess I should ask Anne, sorry to put you on the spot, how many are there that does these things? I mean, it's just, I've never come across it myself, but I'm curious that we're, taking out the remote dispensing site and the blood clotting products. I mean, I think there's like 5 remote dispensing site pharmacy, but, still just curious.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, there's very few remote dispensing site pharmacies. So I believe, given the large number of pharmacies in California that need to complete the form, I think the staff recommendation was to leave a general reference to it and reference to the law sections to assist licensees where it is applicable, taking that same approach also for the bloodborne products and those dealing with drug redistribution. We can create information on our website and links to those references if people are interested in receiving more information, if that's the committee's desire.
I mean, I don't want to complicate things. So no, I mean, if it's complicated, I don't think it's necessary. I just thought, it was there. All the work was there. Just sad to just throw it all away, but it's okay. If it's too much, it's not something that can just be done by staff level to just do it. So I'm okay to not. It's okay.
And then I'm not quite sure how we can make the first 2 comments more clear, because it specifically states the words that you stated there. I mean, the only thing that we could do is, highlight old, those kinds of things, but I can't see of any more words to add to make it more clear. Sung, unless you have some suggestions.
I think it's just it's hopefully just me, not general public, but hopefully it makes sense. But
so, like, for example, when the pharmacy is closed, that 1.24, it specifically says exceeds 3 days and
right
exceeds 4 days.
after, yeah. But I think we just have to be mindful. People read whatever they read first, then they read it, and then they overthink, then they react. So that's my concern. Like, hopefully we can kind of make it more clear in the first sentence what the intent of the regulation was. Same thing as the drug laws reporting. Hopefully they will read the whole sentence and not freak out. I'm just worried about a pharmacist who freak out about, oh my God, like, I close pharmacy for lunch every day for 30 minutes. Then they all think, oh my God, and then someone say something, then they just, that's not true, but it gets spread out. A lot of things that we do, I think we need to be very mindful of the nuances. So just wanted to see. And I don't think that that's something that we have to decide. I think it's something that can be done by the staff level. But I would like to make sure that we are clear and concise. Because of our regulation is so complex, want to make sure that when we add that into the self-assessment, it's a little bit as concise as it could be, while not creating potential confusion for just people who don't live in this space, like, just a regular pharmacist in charge, and who don't have legal, access to any legal help right away. Because, we would just be like, well, talk to a lawyer. And you're like, okay, well, that's not what we want to do. I don't think that's what we want to do. We want it to be something that's simple. But we don't have to decide today. I don't think. I just wanted to bring that to your attention, just from quick
Thank you.
perspective.
Yeah, as we go through the Section 100 process, we'll be mindful for those issues. Any other member comment? Okay, moderator, let's open the lines for public comment on agenda items A through C. This is, again, to remind everybody, community pharmacy / hospital outpatient self-assessment, hospital pharmacy self-assessment, and wholesaler third-party logistics provider self-assessment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've opened up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to make a public comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and submit it to all panelists. Or you may simply raise your hand. If you've called into the meeting, you can press *3 to raise your hand. We are displaying instructions, and we'll give you a moment. And I do see that we have a attendee by the name of Vardui raising the hand. So I will... Vardui, you should be able to unmute yourself. There you go, you're unmuted.
Hello, members. Thank you so very much for these conversations. This is very helpful, and specifically Mr. Sung. I just submitted a question for the inventory reconciliation. We do have a couple of questions. One of them, please define for us, what is your recommendation on a loss? What do you consider a loss? Thank you.
Thank you. I draw your attention to 21.14. It's very specific and repeats the the legal regulatory language. So hopefully that'll answer your question. Thank you.
All right, the next request is from Mark Johnson. And Mark, you should be able to unmute yourself. There you go.
Members of the committee, my name is Mark Johnston from CVS Health. I noticed that there is a mention on the community form concerning remote work. I think that line item may be premature considering tomorrow's licensing committee agenda topic that will address that. So at best, it seems premature. I'm also curious why it isn't consistent with the hospital form. The board's recent interpretation that drastically restricts remote work certainly pertains to hospitals too.
Thank you.
All right, the next request for comment is from Stephen Gray. And Stephen, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Morning. Can you hear me okay? I'm calling from a remote location.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm concerned that the members of the public, those who are on the webinar, and perhaps even some of the newer board members are not familiar with the process that you're recommending about going through Section 100. And I would suggest that take this opportunity for council or maybe for the executive officer to explain that a little further before there is a final decision to go in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Would Anne or Eileen like to offer a few words about Section 100? I did have it in our preliminary remarks for this section, but if that's not clear enough, do you think there's additional information you could provide, Anne or Eileen? Eileen?
I'm sorry, Chair Serpa, this is Eileen Smiley. I think you covered it within the introductory remarks. It's a streamlined process. I think if Anne wanted to go through how she would handle it, I haven't been privy to most of the Section 100 changes that we've done, but I thought you covered in the opening remarks.
Okay, thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. I see no further requests for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Please do, thank you.
You're welcome.
Moving on to the self-assessment form related to automated drug delivery systems. I reviewed the proposed changes and agree with the changes and possible motion offered in the meeting materials. There it is on the screen. Again, you'll note that the bullet points are those from the meeting materials. They highlight the changes. In hopes that this is helpful, I'd like to highlight that procedurally we must address this self-assessment for the ADDSs in a different manner than the prior three. That's because Regulations Section 1715.1 that incorporates by referencing the ADDS self-assessment and the form itself are currently undergoing the rulemaking process. The comment period closed on December 27th, and comments received for those first changes during the comment process will be considered at our full board meeting in February in just a few weeks. So that's what makes this different in that we have this form already going through a regulatory process that's been formally submitted and people have formally submitted comments to those changes. So today our review and discussion is limited just to those new changes being recommended. These changes are noted in the bullet points that are on page 4 of the committee report and on the screen. As indicated on the form, at the very top of the form, it shows that the deleted text, the new changes, the deleted text is shown by the italicized double strike through, and added language is shown as italicized wavy underline. Easy examples to highlight what both those fonts look like are on the first page of the form. The note and the text added shown as italicized and wavy underline as a new change is for our consideration today. The update to the revision date at the bottom of the form is also an example of deleted text. Because the full board will be considering the comments received during the comment period and to assure compliance with government code, it is very important, I'll have to highlight this, it's very important that we limit our comments today only to those new changes, not those previously in regulatory review. The comments of the prior changes will be addressed at the full board meeting in February as a part of the regulatory process. Members, having shared my comments and discussion on the process, I welcome your thoughts on the proposed new changes. And as a reminder, a possible motion is included in the meeting materials if you believe it's if such is appropriate. It's also displayed on the screen. Members, any comments? Anybody want to comment or make a motion?
I make a motion to approve.
Thank
Hi,
you,
Maria.
Sam.
This is Renee. Yeah, I had no
Any
other further
seconds?
comments and I would second that.
Great, thank you. Sung and Renee, can you confirm that the motion as displayed is your motion?
The only part that I would like clarification is, I'm sorry, it's a little hard to follow along because it's just so many changes and so many things, like double strike through, double underline, italicized, wavy underline. I just want to confirm, are we adding that part that says note for a hospital pharmacy operating on ads pursuant, right? That part?
That is wavy underline, so it's an addition.
Yeah,
If you
so
go
when
back
we
one,
say the,
Tricia, can you go back one slide? So there, add notes to the first page.
yeah, so wait, can I just confirm what that note is saying? The PIC may complete a single self-assessment if the mechanical devices used are the same and the same policies or policies. Oh, there's a typo, but that's non-substantive. Policies and procedures are used.
Right, that was a significant discussion that we had in the past about those facilities that have
Right.
large numbers of ADDSs, that they would not have to fill out a form for everyone. They could fill out one if it met certain criteria, and that's listed in CCR 1715.1.
Okay. So just one, right? We're doing, okay, all right. I just wanted to confirm that.
We wanted to put it up front so that you wouldn't be halfway through it and all upset and putting out significant time to fill out 100 forms when you only needed one.
Just, the languages we use are so legalese sometimes, and it's like, okay, can we just say it in plain words? What does that mean?
And interestingly enough, the ADDS does have an FAQ on our website, so it should help walk people through some of these things because the FAQ does go into more detail and example. So just to summarize, our next slide, Tricia, is your motion on the table, this motion, does that suffice?
I would say motion as displayed on the slide.
Hi, this is Renee. Yeah, I would second that, also agree.
Thank you. Moderator, we're ready for public comment. As we open for public comment, the committee respectfully requests that comments be limited to the new changes only proposed in this proposed version. Your opportunity to provide the board with comments on changes in the current rulemaking process are appropriate to make in the February 2023 board meeting. And again, that's only in a few weeks. When all members are present, and we'll be reviewing all the comments submitted, and there's an opportunity for additional verbal comment. When making your comments, since this is a long form, it would be helpful if you could reference the specific section that you're talking about so that we can flip our pages to it and follow along with you. Thank you. I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've opened up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to make a comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and submit it to all panelists, or simply raise your hand. We are displaying instructions and we'll give you a moment. Madam Chair, I see no request for comment at this time. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
With the motion on the floor and no public comment, members, do you have any, do you want to make any further comments or changes, or shall we go on with the vote? I think we'll go on with the vote. Put my page back. Renee Barker.
Approve.
Sung Oh.
Yeah.
Ricardo Sanchez.
Yes.
And the chair votes yes, motion passes. Thank you. Moving on to agenda item 5, discussion and consideration of barriers to time case resolution. Members, as you may recall, one of the committee's strategic objectives is to determine and to reduce barriers to timely case resolution to improve consumer protections. There are many steps involved in the investigation, and the gravity of the violations will in large part determine the outcome of the matter. Later on in this meeting, we'll be discussing enforcement statistics. So I won't go into great detail about that now, but I'd like to highlight that only 7% of the board's investigations result in referral to the Attorney General's office for discipline. I highlight this because there appears to be a perception that the formal discipline process constitutes a significant portion of the board's investigations, and the data shows us otherwise. 7% of our investigations were referred to the Attorney General's office for formal discipline. When we consider aggregate data for investigations, investigation timeframes are currently the longest step in the process. Included in the meeting materials and on this slide are recommendations offered by the staff that would remove some of the barriers. I note that the barriers identified and the changes offered appear to be consistent with the policy of the legislature, and I believe changes are appropriate. I agree with the staff recommendations and would like to thank supervising inspector staff for bringing these recommendations to the committee's attention and for our consideration. I'm in support of the staff drafting statutory language for future consideration. So this is the recommendation that we pursue some statutory language and that we would review in the future on these two recommendations. Members, do you have any comments? Hearing none, I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and submit it to all panelists, or simply raise your hand. We are displaying instructions and we'll give you a moment. All right, I see no requests for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone. I will continue to work with staff and bring back statutory language to our future meeting. Next agenda item 6, overview of federal requirements for compounding under provisions of 503A. Licensees of the board generally must comply with a myriad of state and federal laws. At times, the licensee may be so focused on a specific section of the law that they may forget the larger picture and other provisions of the law that may be relevant. We see this in several areas of pharmacy practice, but is especially pronounced in compounding. To serve as a reminder of some of the federal legal requirements for compounding, Board Counsel Eileen Smiley is going to provide an overview of the requirements for authorized individuals for qualifying for some of the exemptions to federal law under the provisions of 503A, and a slide presentation will direct licensees to resources published and available on the FDA's website. As a reminder, this is not a comprehensive review of federal law, but licensees involved in compounding need to be mindful of federal law requirements and ensure that they are complying with federal law in addition to state law and regulations. Ms. Smiley, the floor is yours.
Good morning, committee members. I just wanted to go through a few things, and this presentation will be available. I think it's going to be added to the website afterwards, which has some links into some of the provisions we're talking about. Debbie, if you could advance the slide. What I just wanted to reiterate, it's become increasingly since 2012 with the compounding era. There is a huge federal overlay now in the compounding area. Both, we're not going to be dealing with outsourcing facilities. That's a whole separate regime. This committee will be concerned solely with the compounding pharmacies and how they must comply with California law. But similar to other areas of pharmacy law, there is now a significant federal overlay to compounding by state licensed pharmacists. Violation of federal law could subject licensees to potential enforcement by the FDA, the Federal Department of Justice, and or discipline of their state-issued licenses or permits. We're just trying to summarize a few areas where you obtain guidance from the FDA, but because this is a legal area. Compounding pharmacies and compounding pharmacists may have to consult with their own attorney or other resources to ensure they're aware of and remain abreast of any changes in the federal law on compounding. I've also included a site that FDA's got great resources on its own website. This human drug compounding thing will take you to a lot of resources at the FDA level. Could you please advance the slide? So generally, as everybody knows, without an exemption, compounding a substance would generally result in a new drug that requires FDA approval. So if there was no exemption under federal law, basically compounding by pharmacies would not be, it would not be practical because you would never be able to get approval for every drug. The 503 exemption is important to note that it only provides an exemption from 3 provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and those are detailed there, and we're also going to cover them in the next slide. Non-compliance with all of the requirements of the 503A exemption could result in violations of one or all of these statutory provisions or other provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And again, the Section 503 exemption does not provide an exemption from all provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, only the 3 ones that are detailed in the exemption. Next slide, please. So basically, these are the 3 provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that compounding pharmacists and pharmacies are exempt from. That is Section 501, with respect to concerning the requirement to comply with current good manufacturing practices. So for instance, if you don't comply with the 503A exemption, the FDA could then say that you violated current good manufacturing practices because you're outside of the exemption. It also provides an exemption regarding the labeling of drugs with adequate directions for use. Failure to comply with the exemption could result in the FDA or with other agencies determining that the labeling of your compounded drug product did not comply with the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And finally, one of the big ones is it's the Section 505. If you comply with the 503A exemption, there's an exemption from the approval of drugs. If you don't comply with 503A with respect to that and you're deemed to have distributed a new drug, you're in violation of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, state law in California, and you could also be subject to violations. For instance, if you lose the exemption as a compounding pharmacist, what they did in the tailor-made compounding case, in the criminal case, they also alleged criminal violation of state wholesaler distributor laws because the pharmacy was not licensed as a wholesale distributor. And again, just keep reiterating, Section 503A exemption does not provide relief from any other provision of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to do, I'm sure most compounding pharmacists and pharmacies are aware of some of the guidance. This is not an exhaustive list, but there are very specific substantive requirements for state licensed pharmacists and pharmacy to qualify for the exemption. They're detailed in the statutory sections, and you should read them. The FDA has also put out written guidance discussing the specific requirements, and there is a link there, and please make sure to distinguish. They have guidance out for 503B facilities, which are outsourcing facilities, which are different from the guidance for compounding pharmacies under 503A. So sometimes you may print out the wrong one. Just make sure if you're a compounding pharmacy, you're looking at the guidance for 503A pharmacies and not outsourcing facilities. And Section 3A of the compounding guidance, pages 2 through 5, detail the conditions of the exemption. So you can go through, but the FDA is constantly updating some of these documents, and I anticipate there's going to be additional changes as the FDA gets more time after the end of the COVID emergency to begin taking up some of these other areas where FDA time is being taken up almost exclusively with COVID and COVID-related treatments. There are also a lot of other guidance documents out there, like their interim policy on compounding using bulk drug substances. There's also, in that one makes clear that one of the terms of the exemption for 503A is there's 3 avenues where you have to look at lists to see whether an ingredient is eligible for compounding. One of them is that there's a USP or NF monograph. The FDA makes clear in this release that what they refer to as a USP or NF monograph means a drug monograph, not dietary supplement or other types of monographs. Next slide, please. Finally, what I wanted to give people a highlight on, I used to work for the federal government. The FDA, when they act to add a substance or do something, they have to do it via proposed and final rules. And they issue proposing and adopting releases that accompany these rules. You should read both releases as the FDA will address substantive comments raised by commenters. So for instance, in a proposed rule that the FDA may be doing, say for instance, they're going to propose to not approve to add a substance to the bulk substance list. They'll ask some questions, and that will be your opportunity to get before the FDA to make your comments part of the federal record. Also, in the final releases, basically the FDA will address a lot of the comments that are raised during the proposal process. So if you want your comments part of the federal record, you need to make the comments directly to the FDA. Also, it's important to read those documents because under legal decisions, positions taken by federal agency and notices subject to notice and comment may constitute interpretations of the agency that are accorded deference if deemed to be a reasonable interpretation. Under legal doctrine, this is referred to as the Chevron doctrine. So you should always not just read the final rule, but you should also look at the proposing and adopting releases. As I said before, I think given the end of the COVID emergency, as the FDA gets more time, we anticipate further guidance and rules to implement the 2012 amendments. When the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was amended substantially in 2012, Congress gave the FDA a 10-year window to implement all of the requirements. I think they effectively lost 3 years due to COVID. They have managed to get some things out, but I anticipate as the FDA gets more time, the implementation, the final implementation of the 2012 amendments will become an area of high importance for them, given the amount of time that they've lost. Also, compounding pharmacists and pharmacies are responsible for knowing and complying with federal law, and they should keep abreast of changes in this area by following the FDA or, when necessary, consulting with their own lawyer. Increasingly, the area of compounding, just like pharmacy law in general, is a highly regulated industry, and basically legal and compliance are considered a cost of doing that business. So if you're unsure about where you should go, you can start with the lawyer, or you can also ask the FDA. They're very easy to contact. Next slide, please. State requirements also apply. So as Chair Serpa was stating, lots of times we get so concentrated on one area or the other, but you need to comply with federal law, you need to comply with California law. Because California law, including pharmacy and health and safety code provisions, also establish requirements for human drug compounding. This committee will be considering changes to California law in response to the USP changes that go into effect in November 2023. The committee does not intend to summarize operative federal law and its regs as a general rule, as federal law could and will change or evolve over time. But the requirement to comply with existing federal law is independent of state law. If you have any questions regarding the operative federal law, you should consult an attorney or other resources, including contacting the FDA. Thank you, Chair Serpa.
Thank you, Ms. Smiley. Members, this information was not intended to be a robust discussion of federal law, but rather to remind us that as we begin the discussion on several areas of drug handling, processing, and compounding triggered by the actions of the USP, we must be mindful of the larger picture. Members, do you have any high-level questions or comments for Ms. Smiley? Thank you. Moderator, I think we're ready for public comment. I'm certain that Ms. Smiley will do so as well, but I'd like to remind everyone that this is not intended to serve as a QA session or an opportunity for a legal opinion. Rather, it's an opportunity for members of the public to comment on the specific agenda item.
And Chair Serpa, this is Eileen Smiley again. I'd also like to emphasize to the public commenters and also to the board members, this is not an opportunity to discuss pending enforcement or disciplinary actions or for anybody to give comments on any type of action and ask for the board's advice. So after public comment is received, I would ask that the board members give me a moment to process or to say something just to ensure that we don't cross over into the lines about talking about any potential disciplinary action that's pending.
Thank you. And Ms. Smiley, if you feel like the public comment is starting to bring up something that's under current consideration, please feel free to jump in and pause the discussion.
I will. Thank you.
Moderator, we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've opened up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, or simply raise your hand. If you've called into the meeting, just press *3 to raise your hand. We are displaying instructions and we'll give you a moment. All right, this is the moderator. I see no request for comment at this time. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Please do. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you again, Ms. Smiley, for your overview. Obviously, in these few minutes, you covered something that could probably be a week-long conference, and we had no specific questions on the high level. So thank you for the successful imparting of this information. It will be very helpful for us in our future meetings.
Thank you, Chair Serpa. And I'm going to turn off my video now because I know we're going to have other presenters.
Great, thank you. Now we're going to switch gears and start our discussion on USP. As we stated, we'll start with 825 today and move on with the other parts of USP chapters over the next few meetings. But since this is a change in gears, I suggest that we take a 10-minute break to give you opportunity to refresh your coffee. And then we'll go over 825, which is radiopharmaceuticals. We have a presentation on the background materials, and then we have the specific details on the proposed regulations coming up this morning. So we'll take a break and we'll come back at, let's come back at 10 or 10:01. Thank you. Either at the end of this presentation with her. So when she does come back on, just promote her.
Sounds good.
Welcome back, everyone. Let's do a quick roll call to assure attendance. Renee Barker.
Hello, present.
Thank you. Sung Oh.
I'm here.
Great. Ricardo Sanchez. Do we see Ricardo? I guess Ricardo is delayed. Hopefully he will moderate. If you could watch when his picture pops up, maybe you can recognize when he comes back. We'll go ahead and get started. Agenda item 7 is presentation on USP General Chapter 825 regarding radiopharmaceuticals. Before we begin our discussion on possible changes to the board's current regulations on radioactive drugs, we'll receive a presentation from Supervising Inspector Christina Costa on the new USP 825 chapter relating to radiopharmaceuticals. The provisions of this chapter become effective on November 1st, 2023. Dr. Acosta, I think I see you there. Welcome.
Good morning, board members. So I get the task of explaining 825. So 825 is going to be slightly different than some of the other chapters that we're going to provide education on. Most of the other chapters will deal with mostly compounding. 825 is a chapter that's going to deal with radiopharmaceuticals, which most pharmacies don't do, but very specialized locations do. 825 is going to deal with the preparation, the compounding, dispensing, and the repackaging. So there's 4 different components to this chapter. Next slide, please. So with any of the USP chapters, each of them has a table of contents. So this is the table of contents, and each is broken down into a section about what is covered there. Based on 825 being radiopharmaceuticals, we are actually going to start with the glossary. Next slide, please. Okay, so under 825, the definition of compounding is going to be combining, mixing, pooling, or otherwise altering of a conventionally manufactured radiopharmaceutical. You see the little snippet in there, excluding preparation with minor deviation. This is, again, going to be something a little different for pharmacists, so we're going to go into that a little bit as well. And under 825, the definition of dispensing, very similar to what we see in our standard retail pharmacies, manipulation or labeling of a radiopharmaceutical to render it in its final form for administration. Preparation, to be separated with compounding, is going to be combining of a conventionally manufactured kit with a conventionally manufactured radionucleotide following the manufacturer's recommended instructions. So here we need to differentiate a little bit about what compounding and preparation are, because that will differentiate about what 825 requires of them. Next slide, please. And so here is our first differentiation, preparation with minor deviation. So if you recall from the slide before, we talked about preparation was the combining of the conventionally manufactured kit with the conventionally manufactured radionucleotide. Well, preparation with minor deviation is slightly in between what would be considered compounding and preparation, because preparation is you're following 100% the manufactured kit instructions. Well, 825 is going to allow preparation with minor deviation. I'm not going to get too much into that because it's a very complex subject, and we don't want to get too deep so that we miss the point of getting to the regulations today. They do have a nice definition of radiopharmaceutical. So radiopharmaceutical is a finished dosage form that contains a radioactive substance in association with one or more other ingredients that is intended to diagnose, stage disease, monitor, treatment, or provide therapy. In general, most of the radiopharmaceuticals that we address do not actually treat a disease. They more pinpoint where maybe the disease or the cancer would be, or where therapy needs to go, or they are part of the therapy. Next slide, please. So repackaging is also part of this chapter. Again, the title is Preparation, Compounding, Dispensing, and Repackaging. So repackaging is the removal of a conventionally manufactured radiopharmaceutical from the container in which it was distributed by the original manufacturer and placing it into different containers without further manipulation. Generally, that's from a larger volume container to a smaller volume container. There is something called a segregated radiopharmaceutical processing area. So throughout 825, you will see SRPA. And basically, that's going to somewhat be similar to that segregated sterile compounding area that we will be talking about in the 797 presentation. Next slide, please. Okay. I like pictures, so we're going to start with some pictures. So in pharmacies, you will see something called a generator. This little device is where they actually have material, the molybdenum is inside, and then they're going to run a saline in one side and then out through the other, and then that's what they call milking the generator. And then you have a radioactive substance called actinium, which is going to come out. So this is the side view and the top. If we go to the next slide, you can kind of see how that is happening. So in the prior, you will see on the left-hand side, there was that little vial. That's where the saline will go in. And then it runs through the bottom of here and then comes out the top as a different substance. So it goes, it's molybdenum inside, and then you milk it, and the actinium comes out. And that is mostly what our pharmacies are dealing with when they are making radiopharmaceuticals. There are several different generators and several different active radiopharmaceuticals that will come out of a generator, but this is the most common one that we will see. You don't need to know all of this, but what you do need to understand is that all of this is foreign to a lot of people, and so these regulations are going to be very specific to a limited number of pharmacies, and this drug is harmful to humans, so there are going to be a lot of different considerations we will talk about. Next slide, please. So that generator will generally be placed in an ISO 8 environment, and then this is what the primary engineering control will look like. It's a little bit different than what we would see in a sterile compounding environment. You'll notice that there's a device that's right up in front of where the compounder or manipulator would be, and we'll get a little bit into shielding and why that is important as we go on. But this is where the manipulation of the product would actually be. Next slide, please. All right, so we talked a little bit about what preparation would be, preparation with minor deviation, and how that relates to conventionally manufactured kits. So those are just some pictures that I borrowed of conventionally manufactured kits. So it's basically an all-in-one type drug that they would take that actinium in and reconstitute, and then it becomes an active radiopharmaceutical to go and to be infused, and then they can do the scan or whatever that product is meant to do so that they can actually see where the cancer is or where something is going on in the body. So next slide, please. All right, so then we talked about preparation. So this is an example of they melt the generator, and then that vial on the picture on the left is part of that. It's actually shielded, or there's a metal casing over the vial that came out of the generator, because one of the most important things is to protect our compounder or our manipulator. So you will see them actually drawing out a certain dose of that actinium, and then in the picture on the right, you will actually see them taking it in that little white container is called a pig, because it's actually a metal container. And so the kit would possibly be put inside there. And so then you would just basically be reconstituting the kit. But again, this is radioactive, so we want to make sure that everything is shielded or surrounded by lead in general. Next slide, please. All right, so then this would be part of dispensing. You will see that, again, she's got the shield. She's in sterile garb, so assumably this is sterile. So in this one, you will see her drawing up. So she's drawing up patient-specific doses, and then the little red things in front of her are a syringe-type pig, so that goes in there and is shielded to protect during transportation and at the compounder, and even before administration for the patient. And what you'll see directly in front of her looks like a little crucible, is actually something that will test the radioactivity. So these products in general have radioactivity, which kind of equates to potency in a regular sterile preparation. So what they actually do is they will know the actual potency or radioactivity of that product by sticking it in there and before it is sent out. And radiopharmaceuticals are dosed by that type of potency, because over time it's just going to slowly degrade. So next slide. Okay, so that's my very high level review of how kind of radiopharmaceuticals work in a very, very general sense. It's much more complex than that. So then let's go to what 825 has. So that first section is the introduction, and it basically is going to tell you that they want minimum standards. So all the USP chapters are going to be minimum standards. And so it's going to be the preparation, compounding, dispensing, and repackaging. It's very important to notice that while dangerous drugs are very regulated, radiopharmaceuticals are even more regulated. So we have radioactive materials. You'll see the term RAM. And they all fall under the regulatory, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So there's a whole nother subset of regulations that they have to comply with. Obviously, they're drugs, so under FDA and us. And then they also regulated by the Department of Transportation and others, because they have to be transported from our pharmacies to where they're going to be used. And a radiopharmaceutical out on our freeways needs to have special shielding and transportation. Next, please. All right, so there is both non-sterile and sterile radiopharmaceuticals that are made in our pharmacies. The bottom line is they need to comply with all the same standards as any compounded preparation. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked briefly about the importance of radiation safety considerations. So as much as it is important that this product is sterile, it is also very important that it is produced in a safe manner, transported in a safe manner, administered in a safe manner. So there's a whole section on how that is required to happen. There is a term called a LARA. So we want the low as reasonably achievable exposure for a worker. And so you're going to see that in radiation therapy that involves time, distance, shielding, and contamination control. So I tried to break down the radiation exposure a little bit for us so we could understand. So time, the amount of time you are exposed to it, is the increased risk. So you're going to see them move a little bit quicker, which when we talk about sterile is not a great thing. We want you to move slow so you don't disrupt the particulate in the air. But in radiation, we do see them move much faster. Distance. So we're going to increase the distance. We will decrease the risk. So you're going to see them use special tools. Shielding. If you have increased shielding, you decrease the risk. So you're going to see special tools and equipment. The other thing you will see is radiation detection and monitoring devices, which are absolutely necessary. Next slide, please. All right, so we just talked about some of those safety considerations. So I just brought back this last picture. So you wouldn't see this in a normal sterile compounding environment. You have that nice metal shield, and that is protecting the compounder or dispenser from any radiation exposure as it's drawn out. Each of those syringes and vials are shielded or leaded so that the radiation cannot escape out onto them. So it's just important to notice that the manipulations are different than what we will see when we talk about USP 797. Next, please. All right, so contamination control is obviously very important. So there's certain things that they will do. We will see absorbed mats, and that would be allowed under 797, required measurements. So the dose calibrator, that little device, that crucible that I was talking about in the hood, it's in there, it's required, it's allowed to be in the hood. You will also see individuals that work in this environment with either a ring and something on their jacket or coat because they need to know how much overall exposure over what time frame that they have it. They are allowed to wear the little rings underneath as long as their gloves still fit properly. Next slide. I'm a picture person. So here you'll see the actual devices. You'll see little tiny rings there, look, just like little plastic rings. And what it will do is we'll tell that person overall what their exposure is for safety. And then there'll be little clips when you go into one of these facilities. Most of the time they will put one on you as well. So it's very important to know that this is a distinct practice difference than what we will see in most just sterile compounding environments. And all of these would be acceptable under the chapter in that sterile compounding environment. Next section, please. All right, so qualifications, training, and hygiene is the next section. Know that there are a lot of things in here that will be similar, but a little bit different than we'll see in 797. Obviously, anybody going into the environment must be trained appropriate. This practice also deals with blood and blood tagging, so they have to have bloodborne pathogen training as well. Next section. All right, so qualifications, if they're going to do sterile manipulations, they obviously have to have SOPs. They will have very similar glove, fingertip, and thumb sampling. Obviously, they have media fills to make sure that not only are they protecting themselves from the product, but the product is being protected from them as well. We want good aseptic techniques, so when our patients get these radiopharmaceuticals, we are not injecting them with a contaminated bag. So this will show that they can manipulate and garb appropriately. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to read you all the requirements. They are all here for you to read. I tried to cut down the chapter, it's 26 pages into fewer slides. So reevaluation, training, and requalification. Somebody has to watch them with the visual observation. Glove, fingertip, and thumb sampling, they do it. Media fills, cleaning and disinfection, they need to have training on how to do that properly. And the new thing that we're seeing in the USP chapters is that if they don't do sterile processing for greater than 6 months, we're going to ask for that requalification to be done, which is kind of amazing. Sterile compounding using non-sterile drug components requires all core competencies, so everything above, to be done in a much more frequent manner. I would say that it's very rare for most of our pharmacies to do this. I mean, I can't even think of last time we found one of them doing this. So next slide, please. Hand hygiene and garbing in the buffer and segregated areas. Very similar to what we would see in the USP 797. If you don't need it in there, don't bring it. You don't need your jacket. You don't need cosmetics. You have to wash your hands before you come in. If you're going to move your hands in and out, you're going to have to use sterile IPA. If your gloves are damaged, we're going to replace the gloves. And when at all possible, to avoid any additional touch contamination. And then when you are leaving the either sterile area or the buffer areas, you are going to take everything off. A gown may be reused if it's maintained within that ISO class environment or the segregated area. Next section, please. So facility design, environmental controls. So the classified areas, so that would be an anteroom room and a buffer room, or the segregated area, it must be maintained at 25 degrees or cooler in temperature. There is requirements for temperature and humidity monitoring, and you are going to see this throughout the chapters as well. It's going to be required on days that compounding takes place or day that is used. And so we are no longer going to see freestanding humidifiers or dehumidifiers or air conditioners in the classified areas. So we're going to have some upgraded HVAC systems. So if you're having that issue, please know that we're going to have to change some equipment probably. Temperature and humidity devices are actually now going to be required under the chapter to be certified and verified as accurate at least every 12 months are required by the manufacturer. Primary engineering control must be located in a secondary engineering control. So it has to be in an ISO class buffer room with an anteroom or in the segregated area. In radiopharmaceuticals, it must be in one. Next section. All right. So we are going to go into terms of a clean room suite when we start talking about 797. So in here, they're going to have the same thing, a buffer room with an anteroom. It's going to have very similar requirements. We are talking fixed walls and doors. All the HEPA filtration is going to have to come in at the ceiling, and low air returns at the floor. The difference with the low air returns than the HEPA filter at the ceiling is if you are able to show that you don't have any pooling or sitting of air. Anterooms are going to need to have the line of demarcation, and you're going to have to be able to enter through the dirty side or less clean side, and your guard must be warm as you cross the line of demarcation. Next slide, please. Segregated area, very similar. It can be unclassified. If you have an ISO classification of 8 in there, you may store that generator that we were talking about for the non-direct infusion. So it depends. Sometimes the tactinium, the actual eluent that comes out of there, is actually what the active ingredient is and doesn't get mixed into a kit. With any segregated area, we wanted away from unsealed doors that connect to the outside, or anything that could adversely affect the airflow. We are going to require a perimeter to be established. It must be visible, and you should not have unrestricted access into there. So next slide, please. All right, so primary engineering control. This is, honestly, it's not a big change from where we are at the moment. Obviously, it needs to minimize microbial contamination. It needs to meet an ISO Class 5 certification. In this environment, it's required to have a PEC in order to do pretty much anything in there. So preparing with minor deviation, dispensing, and repackaging. The only difference is if you're going to do actual compounding of a radiopharmaceutical, it has to be in that clean room suite. It has to have a buffer room, and it has to have an anteroom. Otherwise, you can have just that segregated area. And then what we're going to see in 797 is dynamic airflow smoke pattern tests are going to be required on the schedule. Next section, please. So in the classified area, there's going to be a lot of requirements for the walls, the ceilings. So ceilings and walls, all the junctures are going to be sealed to make sure that we can clean. I'm going to leave this one for you guys to read because it can go on for a while. Next slide, please. All right, so water sources. Obviously, we need to be able to wash our hands and we need to be able to clean, so there's going to have to be a water source, but it's very important that we understand the buffer areas so that clean room, suite, the ante, and the clean room must not contain plumbed water. No sink, no eye wash, no shower, nor floor drains. An ante room must not contain a floor drain. So there is the opportunity in an ante room to have some water sources. Obviously, we need to wash our hands, so there should be an accessible sink. So if you're going to do a segregated area, the sink must be acceptable, but located at least 1 meter from the primary engineering control and the generators. So keep that in mind. That is a standard that is in effect for 797 now. Next, please. All right, environmental controls. Obviously, we want to make sure that our environment is clean as possible to make sure that we don't contaminate our product. But it's very important in this environment that we understand sometimes that radioactive materials license condition may supersede the requirements for environmental controls. So it's very important that you understand safety, sometimes of the environment or the worker will actually oversee the product. And it's important that we strike a balance in that so that our products are as safe as possible as well. It is important to mention that most radiopharmaceuticals, even after use of a commercially manufactured kit, most of them have no potency or activity within 12 hours. So these are very short-lived products once manipulated. So your facility may have positive and negative depending on what you're doing, and that will be specific to the facility. You are going to have pressure monitoring devices so we know that the environment is not being contaminated by the product. Next slide, please. Okay. So air and surface monitoring, just like we're going to see with 797, it is required. It is slightly different frequencies than we're going to see in 797, but know that there will be environmental monitoring to make sure that we don't have viable air or surface contaminants that we aren't aware of. Next slide, please. All right, so this is just the basic overview of the viable air. So it is just like with 797 and current regulations, volumetric impact devices are required. Settling plates are a thing of the past. They don't take a good overall sample. The chapter is going to require, if your action limits are exceeded, it must be investigated, corrective action must be taken, and attempts must be made to identify any microorganisms. So the little table below actually shows, depending upon the ISO classification of the area, how many viable air contaminants there can be, or CFUs, so colony forming units. So you can see if you're in a primary engineering control that is a 5, if you have greater than 1, meaning 1 is allowed, greater than 1, then you must investigate, do a corrective action, attempt to identify the microorganism. Next slide, please. And this is the surface monitoring. Very similar. You'll note that the action levels on the table below are slightly higher. So this is actually what is on the surface or in the hood or on a table or a door handle. It depends on where they choose to monitor. There's a scheme on how and where you would do your viable sampling on. Next slide, please. Okay, cleaning and disinfection. With all pharmacy areas, and especially compounding and then sterile compounding, we have requirements and frequencies for cleaning, disinfecting, and adding of a sporicidal agent. You'll see that the sporicidal agent pretty much everywhere in the facility is monthly. Cleaning, so that frequency is going to be that second column, and you'll see each individual day. Most of the time you're going to see that the cleaning stuff is going to be daily. That's all going to be the high touch areas. It's going to be the same for most of the chapters as daily. And then disinfection, you're really going to see in the sterile environment to be daily. In this chapter and all the other ones, you're going to see if it's contaminated or it's known to be contaminated, you're going to go through a cleaning and disinfection process again too. Next slide. Assignment of a BUD. So this one is quite complicated. What I would remind you is that each of these environments is different, and each of these kits is a little bit different on what it's what it's doing and how it is prepared. In general, most of them do not have a lot of activity past the 12-hour. So assigning a BUD for the sterility of a radiopharmaceutical, even where you see that 96 and 24, it may have sterility to that point, but it doesn't mean that it has a whole lot of activity. So keep that in mind. There is the allowance to do that because you are in a clean room, but that doesn't mean that that's the appropriate BUD for activity for the patient. Next slide, please. All right, documentation. My favorite thing about documentation is if you did it, write it down, and please keep it. So you will see that in this chapter and all of the chapters, there's a very set of documents that they have to keep. And in this chapter, it's interesting because the master formulation record, which is our new verbiage, master formulation record, or MFR, is only required for preparation with minor deviation and compounding. So when you do the preparation, which is making it pursuant to the FDA approved directions in those kits, you do not have to have a master formulation record. So keep that in mind. Next section, please. Preparation with minor deviations. So that's the one where I'm going to make a kit, but I'm going to do something just a little bit different. Let's just say the FDA approved it to have a water bath to heat up the substance. And instead of a water bath, you're going to use a hot plate. That would be considered a minor deviation, depending on what drug you're dealing with. So, or you're going to add a little bit more volume or something to that effect. So this is going to be a case-by-case scenario. I don't want to get too much into that, but know that that is going to be an allowable practice. The line that's going to be difficult to draw is between preparation with minor deviation and when it becomes compounding. So next slide, please. Okay, preparation of a radio-labeled blood component. It's a very small subset of population, but there is the need to draw a patient's blood, take it to a radiopharmaceutical pharmacy where they actually label it. And by labeling is they take radiopharmaceuticals and attach it to the blood cell, and then it goes back into the patient. Then they do a scan when it's in there, and that scan will help them to identify where certain diseases are going on. It must be administered as soon as possible, but no later than 6 hours after the blood sample is obtained from the patient. So that is a very, very short time frame to get it from where the blood draw was to the pharmacy, into the pharmacy's clean room, labeled, and then back out to the patient. So keep that in mind. These are very, very short durations. When we were talking about the sterility BUD, that's all well and good. It's a 6-hour sterility BUD, but again, we're dealing with a blood sample, and you need to be very careful not to cross-contaminate with somebody else's blood, and also to make sure that you don't contaminate yourself or your environment. Next slide, please. All right. So compounding non-sterile radiopharmaceuticals, again, there is certain capsules that are made on a regular basis. It would be very in line with what 795 is going to require. It just depends on the actual stability of the ingredients and the containers, what BUD may be allowed here. And we do need to have a clean environment, an uncluttered environment for them. Next slide. Sterile compounding. I would say that a majority of what we are going to see in our pharmacies will no longer be considered sterile compounding. We are going to see preparation far more than sterile compounding because preparation is per the manufacturer's kit. And so this would really be, they would have to use aseptic technique, obviously an ISO 5, and it just really depends. We don't see really too many doing non-sterile components into sterile, but it does happen, and 825 does give us some guidelines or guardrails in how it's going to happen. Next slide. Dispensing. So most of the time you're going to see dispensing of what we saw, the little red pigs. You're going to see them take it out and draw it out, just patient-specific doses based on the radioactivity that's done from the radio assay and that dose calibrator. The dose calibrator is kind of like the little crucible thing that I keep mentioning. And it's a mathematical calculation. So like I don't even know what the term is, but like they start at like 10 and every hour they drop 1 and 1 and 1. So the farther out the dose gets, the less activity or potency that product will have. So they literally calculate it based on when it is done. So it's very precise, and the timing is very important in radiopharmaceuticals. Next slide, please. Labeling. Just like with any compounded prep, we are going to have two terms. We're going to have labeling, which is everything that goes with the product, and then we're going to have the label. And this particular one is very important because you have to understand is that those containers are shielded. And so there's much bigger containers, but there's very specific things that have to be on them. Some of them may be related to the Department of Transportation on that outer one as well. But as far as what's required under 825, that's listed below for you as well. Next slide, please. Repackaging. So repackaging isn't something we see a ton of either, but it would basically be taking a larger volume, and then it would be taking it and just putting it into smaller volume syringes for patient-specific doses. And it again must have that radio assay or to know how much potency or radioactivity it has when it goes out, so you can calculate what it will have or what you actually need at the time of administration. And there's specific labeling requirements for that also. Next slide, please. Quality assurance and quality control. You're going to hear a lot about these two things over the next couple months. USP brought in this concept, which is really a wonderful concept for pharmacies. It's more a tune of what we see in CGMP, but it fits beautifully these practices. So the quality assurance is really going to be the whole system to ensure that your product meets quality standards, right? And the quality control is really going to be the testing that you have, samples testing and documentation that show that that product meets your specification before it goes out. So in radiopharmaceuticals, the quality control is really that radio testing that happens in that dose calibrator kind of before it goes out. 825 is going to require the programs to be formally established and documented, but you're going to see that to be throughout all of the chapters. Next section, please. Yes, I made it. All right. So 825 is the first of several that we're going to go over. And I am here. If there's questions, back to you, Maria.
Thank you, Dr. Acosta, for the great overview. This is truly a unique practice environment that many of us are not familiar with. And it is very interesting, I think, to those, if this is the first time that you've looked at or been exposed, that's using the term, I guess, to 825, is that the themes and areas covered are well known to all of us that are involved with compounding. So it's not unfamiliar, just a different practice setting that is very unique. And you did a great job, Dr. Acosta, in bringing us up to speed. Thank you. Members, do you have any questions or comments?
Hello, it's Renee. Yeah, I had a couple questions. Thank you, Christine, for that very difficult subject. Appreciate it. You are correct. I mean, it's not something that a lot of us see, but it's very interesting and obviously important for patients and the workers. So I do have a couple questions. So one of them was in the qualifications for the workers, that was your 4.1 aseptic qualifications. So I just had a question. So that first one, it just varies from how we look at training for sterile compounding, which is, it reads qualifications may be conducted at a different site if all SOPs are identical for the applicable job function. So I guess what I'm curious is, so SOPs may be identical, but if staff have their qualifications done in a location, but then they go to work in a possibly different location, but may have different equipment. So I know that there are different hoods, there's different room types, probably different equipment. Anyway, so I'm just curious. So typically, you would have to be qualified in each different area. So how is that going to apply for the sterile compounding? Even though I think like what you said, there's very low amounts of sterile compounding, but I guess that may not be zero either.
Right. So in the scope of what a radiopharmaceutical would do, so the primary engineering control is always going to be a biological safety cabinet. It's always going to have that shielding in front of it. So the equipment that they use is going to be very similar in most instances, unlike a hospital practice where we could see, a CAI, a CACI, we could see a biological, we could see a laminar flow, we could see an edge guard, and there's all these different mixes in these facilities. Really, the only thing that is appropriate is a biological safety cabinet. You would not want a flow of air coming out because of the pharmaceutical contamination, so that radioactivity. So the equipment's going to be very similar. So as far as aseptic technique, that is somewhat carried over. Also because there's only like 3 or 4 different companies that actually do this in this state, at least. I don't know if there's some outside. Practices are very, very similar. So yeah, it is something, it's actually highlighted in my notes, and it's very different than where California law is as far as USP 797. As the policymaker, if it's something that you're uncomfortable with, I'm more than willing to to dive into that and make your comfort level. For me, I do see how that's applicable because radio pharmacy technicians and pharmacists, there's not a whole lot of them. And sometimes what will happen and where this would be beneficial for them is truly, if somebody is not available, this technician would then be able to go to the nearest facility and help there. Is there risk to the consumer is always my question. It is always possible. Does that help?
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
And then I had another question. I did have the opportunity a while back, and it was somebody who was learning aseptic technique, but trying to manipulate with lead gloves. But I believe that would have been probably a manufacturer facility that person was from. Did you come across that? I mean, they were trying to don, as part of a qualification, to don sterile gloves on top of like a lead glove. So I don't see really any mention of that, but I don't, this is fairly new for me, but just curious if you came across any of that. Or
I've never seen a lead glove. I don't know how you would manipulate a needle, more or less these shielded needles. If you remember that picture, I mean, yes. I don't know how you would do that.
It was very, very bulky, but if you did not come across it, I'm seeing, I think it would be somebody working with a source and they had no other means of protection, whereas it looks like the product and the syringe are lead lined. So, again, it's that balance between protecting the person, manipulating, and the sterility of the product. In our pharmacies, we really see them using sterile gloves. Mm-hmm. So then about the sterile gloves, so I'm just curious what I know, and further reading it, talks about frequent application of a sterile isopropyl alcohol. So is there certain stages? I mean, where they would have that? I'm not seeing it. In your, of course, it's just one snapshot. I do appreciate all your pictures. I think that's super helpful. But just curious if, so there's, at least in those pictures, I don't see any, see any sterile alcohol. And so does that get exposed in the hood? Just curious.
Right. So, in my experience, it's in the biological safety cabinet, or sometimes they will have a cart that's next to it, very similar to what we would see in regular 797 practice. And you would spray your hands when they come out of the ISO 5. In most of these environments, we don't see them coming in and out. They are in, they do their manipulation, and then they come out. So the sterile alcohol would really only be sprayed as they go in. Of course, we would want all of the equipment before it goes in the hood to be disinfected and cleaned if necessary, depending on what we're talking about. Yeah, but all of the shielding that's in there that does calibrator, all of that is cleaned on a regular basis and then disinfected. But obviously, the more we can spray the alcohol on contaminated surfaces, the better. But our direct compounding site, or where that needle goes in, is very shielded as well. So actually spraying alcohol on some of those sites is difficult.
Mm-hmm. Actually, and I just have one last question about the dose calibrator. So very unfamiliar with that. But how, I see, like you said, looks like a crucible, has that little open space in the middle. But how does that calibrate the dose? Do they put the patient syringe in there? I guess I'm just really not familiar with that one.
I don't know if it's the proper term to say the dose calibrator. Then I think it's just like, they call things pigs and milking. And so I've kind of thrown in some of those terms in case somebody brings that up. So it is my understanding it's this circle, and there's kind of like a pulley system. If you go back to that slide, you'll see that there's a pulley system that goes down. They attach the syringe or the vial in, and then they lower it down, because you don't want to touch it. And then it actually calculates the radiopharmaceutical activity, right? And so if I know, and I just gave horrible things, like the radioactivity is 10, but my patient needs a dose, keep going. It's the dosing pictures, like three down. They do that, and it'll say, okay, your radioactivity is 10, and I need a activity of 6 when the patient gets it in 3 hours. I do that calculated math. Yeah, so that crucible, it goes down, and then they pull it back up, and it just calculates what it is, and then they do a math equation to say, okay, well then, instead of 1 ml that's 10, I'm going to need 3 mLs, which the total would give me this, because as it degrades in that 4 or 5 hours, then I'll still have the dose the patient needs. So it's not really a dose calibrator, it's a radioactivity thing. And then you calculate, you need to have it as a starting point, and then you can calculate your dose, if that makes sense. And by all means, I learned this on the job. So you know what I mean? I ask a lot of questions, I read a lot of things, but it's a very interesting area of practice for me.
So once the patient doses, looks like it's, drawn out of the source container, does the needle stay on? Is it capped? Just curious for, just that part.
Yeah. I don't know that answer. I believe that the needle is removed because the needle would be an area of leaking, but I'm not 100% sure on that, because the pigs aren't that long. If you think about the size of a syringe, then you put the needle on the top of it, and even the needle on the top of it it doesn't make it a closed system, but they'd have to cap it somehow. I don't have that answer, because normally when they're doing these manipulations, I'm not that close. Yeah. I'm usually as far back as I can. It's a good question. I bet you there's somebody on the line listening that could answer that, though.
Yeah, and I can do a little more digging myself. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Welcome.
I don't have any more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Members, any other questions? Okay, moderator, we're ready for public comment. As a brief reminder, public comment is an opportunity to provide comment on the information provided and not a question and answer session. As indicated in the meeting materials, USP does have frequently asked questions available on its website, and it's a very good resource. The hyperlink is included in the meeting materials. Let's go to public comment.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. I've opened up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to make a comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of the screen and submit it to all panelists. Or you may simply raise your hand. People who have called into the meeting on their phones can raise their hand by pressing *3. We are displaying instructions, and we'll give you a moment. All right, I see no requests for comment at this time. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Please do, thank you.
You're
and thank you again, Dr. Acosta. I'm hoping that you'll stay with us, as we will have probably some detailed questions that we may have for you.
Yes, I will be here.
Okay, great, thank you. I also forgot to note that Ricardo Sanchez did join us during your presentation, so if the record could note that.
That was only like 3 minutes, I believe. I was on here and I came on. I think
Thank
you
you.
said 8:01 and it was like 8:05 or something.
Okay. I believe we were trying to do a sound check for an individual. Did that individual come back, moderator?
Thank you, Madam Chair. She did. Grace Rodriguez?
Hi, good morning.
Wonderful. We can hear you.
Thank you.
Should I introduce Grace or should introduce? And Grace, can you introduce yourself and your role to the group and what you're going to be helping us go through the next section?
Yes, good morning. Oh, sorry, I was trying to turn the video on there. Good morning, everyone. I am Grace Arupa Rodriguez. I'm here in the capacity as Regulations Counsel for the board. I understand, I think someone in the from the board will be doing the presentation, but if there's legal issues that I can address regarding this regulation, I'll be here to help with that. So I am substituting this morning, but I am here on behalf of the board as Reg Counsel. So good morning, everyone.
Great, thank you. Your resource will be very helpful. As we go on to our next agenda item 8, discussion and consideration of proposed addition to Title 16, California Code of Regulations, Section 1738, related to radiopharmaceuticals. Okay, everyone ready? We're going to dive in. As we begin our work on the various USP chapters and review current and proposed regulations that may be necessary to implement, clarify, or make more specific requirements related to these respective chapters, I believe it is appropriate that any such regulations mirror the structure of the respective USP chapters. This means that the numbering format and section titles for the proposed regulations will mirror the USP chapter. Just to be clear, our goal is not to reiterate USP language, but to clarify and make more specific the requirements as stated in USP. If no clarification is needed, there will be no additional language proposed. Okay. As stated as a part of my opening remarks, the board is a consumer protection agency. As we consider development of regulations, it will be through the lens of the board's consumer protection mandate, as law makes clear whenever the protection of the public is inconsistent with other interests sought to be promoted, the protection of the public shall be paramount. This is a dynamic process and individuals will have opportunities to participate through the development and the rulemaking process. With that understanding, unless members have any specific questions about the process, I suggest we begin. Looks like there's a technical issue, so let's pause here for a couple of minutes. Moderator, I think we may be able to get the answer here without having to go to a formal break. Okay, so we don't have to have a formal break. Thank you. No problems. The technology is there for us as we go through the next section. I intend to discuss each section first as a committee, then to ask the moderator to open the lines for public comment. We can refine the language through our discussion with the understanding that any language we amend today will be reviewed by council. Following the end of public comment, I will summarize the comments received for each section. I said that twice because some people will get confused. For each section, and we can determine if additional changes to the proposed language is appropriate. I've requested that staff display the language during this portion of the meeting to allow for edits to be made during the meeting where we believe changes are appropriate, and that's what you see on your screen now. As I previously stated, this is just the beginning of the regulatory process. There will be additional opportunities for the board and for members of the public to consider language and to provide comments. Also, to many of us, there may be new concepts discussed today. In addition to relying on our own expertise and understanding, Supervising Inspector Acosta is available to assist us where we require technical input. Once again, members, do you have any questions on the process or are we ready to begin? Okay, so if You have your paper handout. It is attachment 4, and it's also going to be displayed on the screen, but we're going to go through a lot of the details, so keeping track of the language is going to be helpful for us. So the first proposed language you will note is the repeal of CCR sections 1708.3 through 1708.5. The new regulations as proposed would establish a new section, 1738. I believe this is appropriate and will make compliance easier for licensees by having the information centralized. Members, do you have any comments on this section? This is the repeal. Moderator, we're ready for public comment on the repeal of the existing sections.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. Send it to all panelists or simply raise your hand. We'll give you a moment. All right, I see no request for comment at this time. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. The first new proposed section is 1738. This proposed language incorporates USP Chapter 825 into the regulation, providing clarity to the board's regulated public that the requirements of USP Chapter 825 must be met. The authority for such requirement is established in several sections of pharmacy law as detailed in the language. Members, do you have any comments on this section? I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of your screen or simply raise your hand. We'll give you a moment.
Okay.
All right, I see no request. Shall I close the Q&A?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Moving on, 1738.1 as proposed, again reinforces the applicability of USP Chapter 825 and the definitions included within the chapter. It further provides additional definitions for terms used in the chapter and proposed regulations that are not otherwise defined. Providing these definitions assures members of the regulated public have a clear understanding of the board's definitions when applying both provisions of the chapter and the board's regulations. The proposed definitions added include added substances, designated person, component, diluent, processing, processed, or processing activity, as well as requirements for use of technologies, techniques, materials, and procedures not described in 825, as well as provisions for processing with human whole blood and human whole blood derivatives. Members, I've reviewed the language and believe it is appropriate. Do you have any questions or comments on this section? Okay, I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel, and members of the public may either type that they'd like to make a comment or raise their hand. All right, I see no request. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Yes, thank you.
Welcome.
We've gone through several of the easier sections that will get more complicated, so hang on, we will have a lot of discussion coming up. As proposed, section 1738.2 related to radiation safety considerations again rely on the standards established in the chapter. Further, the language will assure the appropriate placement of equipment, and etc. to minimize disruptions in airflow. The language will require that disposable absorbent pads are changed to prevent cross-contamination and requires documentation within the SOP of necessity of deviations. Members, I reviewed the proposed language and believe it is appropriate. Do you have any questions or suggested changes in this section? Seeing none, I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. Members of the public can type comment if they'd like to make a comment, or else raise their hand. We'll give them a moment. All right, I see no requests for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Thank you.
Welcome.
Moving on to proposed section 1738.3 establishes the standards for immediate use of sterile radiopharmaceuticals and will ensure licensees have clear understanding that the records required in the chapter must be maintained consistent with the provisions of Business and Professions Code 4081. I've reviewed the language and believe it is appropriate. Members, do you have any questions or suggestions?
Hello, it's Renee. Hey, I just have a question about possible clarification for C. Again, that was one of my questions for Christine, which was aseptic qualifications from one premises may be used for another premises if the SOPs, facilities, and equipment are identical. So with the word identical,
Okay, Renee, I think that's the next section. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Hey, put a pin in it. We'll come back to it. That's a good one.
Sneak peek.
There you go. Any member comments on 1738.3? I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, or simply raise your hand. All right, I see no requests for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Yes, thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, now we're at the section 1738.4 related to personnel qualifications, training, and hygiene. This section establishes requirements necessary for public protection while providing for professional judgment of the designated person to make site-specific and person-specific decisions on a case-by-case basis. The regulation is relying on appropriate SOPs to appropriately define some of the processes that may occur. Members, I believe the language strikes the right balance for radiopharmaceuticals, and I'm comfortable with the proposed language as it relates to radiopharmaceuticals in this section. Members, do you have any questions or comments? Renee?
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, so I guess if I somewhat paraphrase my question, but so for C, about the aseptic qualifications from one premises to another, it says if the SOPs, facilities, and equipment are identical. So identical, I mean, would be like the exact same. So I'm just wondering for these facilities, if again, I'm without having a lot of background on how the facilities may vary, so or the equipment. So in my question to Christine, like the equipment, she said, they're like they are biological safety cabinets, but there are, I'm assuming, some various different kinds and manufacturers, so they wouldn't really be identical in that sense. So I don't know if some kind of clarification is needed for
a good point, because this is actually what we're doing in our regulations, and is to clarify and to make known what the California expectations are. Because as you stated, USP is a little more broad in general, whereas in California regulation, we're actually saying it more strictly. We're saying identical, not so broad. Because when Christine made her presentation, that was about USP, not about our regulations. So she answered your question based on what USP states. But she's also here so she could speak up also, that we are suggesting it be more specific and less broad. Chris, do you have anything to say about what your answer was to on the previous discussion versus what we're talking about now? Did I summarize it well?
So I think what Ms. Barker is getting at is the term identical. Because the way USP says it, it's just the SOPs, right? So we went a step further and say, okay, fine, if you want to do your SOPs, the facility and the equipment. So I think I would probably defer that to legal to see whether or not that's specific enough. And it doesn't say, I wouldn't read it to be as identical as what you're saying. So normally when we talk about primary engineering control, we kind of lump them into the type of equipment, right? So biological, horizontal flow, CAI, and CACI. So to me, most of them would be considered to be identical, but it's also broad enough that if they did some really inventive manipulation in there in one and it's not in another one, that maybe we could use it to say it wouldn't be compliant. So that's my thought process on it, but I do see what you're saying with the identical. So Grace, I kind of would defer to you to see if it was good enough.
Yeah, no, that is, it would actually fall, I think, under, it's definitely gray, because, you know, the pure meaning of identical is exact, right? So if a standard operating procedure didn't match exactly, there is room to argue that, well, then it's not identical and it wouldn't, it would not, that it wouldn't apply. So I do think there's an opportunity to clarify if we would like, but you know, we could, if once we do start defining identical, I think that's where, you know, if we say substantially identical, then we're going to have to give some parameters as to what that means. So I think it's certainly something we could take a look at to clarify it further, but at the same time, it's not necessarily one that would automatically trigger, you know, the Office of Administrative Law won't necessarily point that out to say, you need to clarify this further, because they're going to look at it and say, it's identical, and that's what you mean, it's identical. But if we are going to be ever taking any kind of enforcement action or trying to, you know, narrow that field down or allow for broadness, it does help to put some parameters around it.
I would say that that identical should probably be applied most certainly to SOPs. And like you said, I mean, those would be sort of word for word, you know, processes that are defined. But perhaps facilities and equipment could have some type of elaboration, like you mentioned. That's my suggestion for that.
No, I could see where you're going, Renee, because of our practice background. We're used to seeing a myriad of different iterations of different facilities and equipment. So it doesn't mean the same make and model of a hood, for example. And maybe there's a way to suggest some clarity where we could say similar facilities and equipment types, because I heard from Christine, it's the type of equipment, not the specific make and model, but the type that is the identical part.
Mm-hmm.
And I would add, once we start putting like similar equipment or facilities, that will trigger the Office of Administrative Law to say, can you describe what is similar in your world? So I think we would probably have some language that we'd have to provide some guidance as to what we are considering similar as a board.
So I see Anna's trying to guess what we're saying, but I would, maybe it's something starting just with the equipment, because I think that would probably is say equipment types. Christine, is that appropriate? What would you call those types? Like BSC is a type of hood?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would say in general. So I think for me, the SOPs and the facility have to be identical. And when it comes to facility, what I mean by identical is it's either a clean room suite to a clean room suite, or it's a segregated to a segregated. I don't think there's any other type of facility that they would really have, because those are the requirements of 825. And then when it comes to the equipment, I mean, nobody's going to use a laminar flow hood in radiopharmaceuticals that is not vertical. Do you know what I mean? So to say type of equipment, they're all going to use, I don't know. You know what I mean? As far as the equipment, I understand what you're saying. The facilities and the SOPs are easy for me. The equipment's more difficult.
Well, I think, Renee, equipment types, I think might be helpful, because I think when we think of identical, we think of the exact same make and model. And that could be very challenging and beyond the scope of what we really want to say. So Anne has suggested some words in here, and this could be part of our final language once we get to public comment too. But Renee and Grace and Christine, what do you think of the language that has been adjusted a little bit here?
I think just hearing what's been discussed, I think SOPs and facilities are identical would capture what the intent is, and equipment used. Is there a standard of equipment, like equipment shall meet the standards under 825? Is there something to that effect? Or equipment use shall meet, and then there's a standard that's required? Like you mentioned earlier, like the vertical equipment use shall be, I don't know what the proper term is, but if it's, if there's different makes and models, you're basically saying equipment use shall meet this minimum requirement. And I'm not sure what that requirement is, but if there is a specific one we could point to, I think that would meet your objectives.
I'm also wondering if the equipment is spelled out in USP specific enough that we don't need to say it, and we just talk about premises,
that's good. Yep.
And facilities, and just period.
That's a good point. That's a great point, actually.
Can I also add that perhaps equipment is too broad, and since we really are specifically discussing like the primary engineering control, because equipment, you could also include the dose calibrator. I think that hood had I don't even know, some device on the side. There could just be other, equipment. I mean, so maybe we dial it down to, PEC type. I'm not sure if that starts to be, calling it out, but again, back to the higher level, look at just what's presented here is just identical. So I think we need to decide what we're trying to be specific about. What do we want to specify?
Renee, would you be okay if we just took out the equipment and let the USP regulations or standards stand for equipment? That California would just be looking for our SOPs and facilities to be identical, and then the rest of it be according to USP.
Yes.
Christine, how does that look?
My concern is by removing equipment, we're dealing with the secondary engineering control and SOPs. We're not dealing with the primary engineering control unless you want to broadly use facility to include the primary engineering control, which is not how it was written originally, but I think it could be because it's part of the facility, right?
Yeah.
Because that's, to me, in a sterile environment, that being similar or the same or identical, whatever we choose to use, is quite important. Is the shielding in front of me? Am I stepping to the side of it? Do I have a dose calibrator here versus here versus here? Some of that can make manipulation differences. But if we want to use it broadly, facility to mean identifying the primary and secondary engineering control, I have no issues with that.
I think think it makes it easier than to get into the weeds with the equipment. So we could start with this, what we have here. So does that meet the needs of what you were talking about, Renee and Christine? Does that meet the needs of going forward?
We might need to have possibly in our, like, a definition of facilities.
So those things are all in USP. We don't.
True.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other comments on this section? And like, once again, we can revisit this, but we just, this is certainly not the last time that we'll look at this language. We have lots of time. Any other any other comments on this section, Renee, or any other board members? Okay, I think we're ready for public comment. They may have some comments on this also.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of the screen and submit it to all panelists, or simply raise your hand. There is a 3-minute time limit for the sake of time, and I do see Susan Vanilla with her hand raised. So Susan, you should be able to unmute yourself. There you go.
The CEO for the California Pharmacists Association. I just wanted to say I really appreciated the discussion that was just had. Having clarity is like gold. We really appreciate clarity at all times. And so thank you so much for taking the time and the consideration with this wording, because it really will help pharmacists across the state. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, this is the moderator. I see no further requests for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So members, having received public comment, I believe that the changes as shown on the screen are appropriate, but I'm interested in your final thoughts on this section, making the changes to the proposed language. Are we okay with the proposed language and moving forward? Okay, thank you. Next section, 1738.5, establishes the requirements for facilities and engineering control. Oh, deja vu. In addition to standards established in the chapter, among other changes, the proposed regulations will require that a sink used for compounding and hand hygiene shall not be part of the restroom or water closet. Some of the regulation language is being included where the chapter is silent, where the USP chapter is silent, to provide clarity. As example, proposed 1738.5H explicitly states that only activities necessary for processing radiopharmaceutical may be performed in the SRPA. Members, I agree with the draft language in this section and welcome your comments or questions. This is 1738.5.
Hi, this is Renee.
Good. Good.
I just have a question about using the term water closet. So what are we saying that is? I mean, when I try to find definitions, sort of looks like an antiquated restroom. But I mean, I may be just completely missing something here.
No, that's a good question. I assume that it's a legal reason. Grace or Christine?
So I pulled it when I was working with the agency formerly known as OSHPD, and it was something that was in their regs. And that's why I put that in there. I don't have any idea the actual parameters within it, but it was something that was throughout their regs. That's why I put that in there.
So when you look at water closet, I mean, it says like a room with just a toilet. So I'm just not finding the connection with a sink, but I just may not have that definition, but I certainly understand I've been through some of the building codes, but anyway, I'm just wondering if we, do we need that if we're not quite sure about water closet?
It's fine, because I mean, the intent is that in building code, my understanding of it is that a restroom could be built with one set of parameters, and a water closet can be built with another set of parameters, meaning the sink is separate, but the use of that sink would still be the same. It would be contamination after using the restroom to wash your hands, and that would not be a sink that would be appropriate for washing your hands for sterile compounding. That's my thought process.
Okay, I'm not sure how much that term is used. So I mean, if it's used or understood by more than me, but I just trying to keep it, as kind of relevant as possible.
I think we appreciate that comment. I think it is because it is still found in comparable other regulations that it's used. It probably does sound like an outdated term, but if we use something limiting to just restrooms, we might inadvertently allow then folks to be washing their hands in something other than a restroom that isn't sterile. So, but I appreciate that it is an antiquated term, just happens to also be a term that's still used and found in other statutes. So it's making it consistent.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions on this section? I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. Members of the public may either use the Q&A panel or raise their hand to indicate they would like to make comment. All right, I see no request for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Great, thank you. 1738.6 again incorporates USP standards related to microbiological air and surface monitoring, and as proposed includes requirements that are silent in the USP chapter. Such an approach provides clarity to the regulated public and ensures everyone has a clear understanding of the board's requirements. I agree with the draft language in this section, and members, I welcome your comments. This is 38.6. Renee, any comments? I know this is your area of expertise too, so feel free to comment. Don't feel
like you've heard from me. No, I actually don't from this section.
Great, thank you. I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and submit it to all panelists, or simply raise your hand. We'll give you a moment. All right, I see no request for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Please do, thank you.
You're welcome.
Section 1738.7 establishes provisions for cleaning and disinfecting, again requiring compliance with provisions of the chapter, as well as explicitly stating that the agent's use must be done so consistent with the manufacturer's specifications. In addition, the regulation language as proposed prohibits the storage of reusable cleaning supplies within 1 meter of the PEC. This prohibition is included in Chapter 1797, but it's not in 825. Members, I agree with the draft language and welcome your suggestion. (1738.7). Okay, I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment, please indicate by typing comment and sending it to all panelists, or simply raise your hand. All right, I see no request for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Proposed 1738.8 will provide additional requirements for assigning beyond use dates to provide clarity and to address issues not specifically included in the chapter. The chapter provides the process performed but does not account for the expiration date of the ingredients. This is a common violation found in compounding, making inclusion appropriate as it provides clarity to the regulated public. Further, not all manufacturing packages package inserts allow for the extension of the use by date. Proposed language allows for an extension by establishing minimum provisions that must be satisfied to extend the use by date. Members, I agree with the draft language in the section and welcome your comments and questions. We're getting into the details here, so I appreciate your patience, everyone. I think we're ready for the public.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and submit it to all panelists, or simply raise your hand. We'll give you a moment. All right. I'll see no request. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
1738.9 relates to documentation requirements. Among the changes as proposed, the language will establish a requirement for a compounding record if the facility is deviating from the manufacturer's approved labeling. Further, as proposed, the regulation language makes clear that records must meet the requirements established in sections 4081 and establish an audit trail for revisions and updates of the records. I agree with the proposed language and welcome your thoughts and comments. I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of the screen and submit it to all panelists, or simply raise your hand. We'll give you a moment. All right, I see no request for comment. Shall I close the Q&A?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Section 1738.10 establishes the standards for preparation. In some instances, the proposed regulation will be requiring something that is permissive in the chapter. Further, as proposed, the language requires documentation when deviations from the manufacturer's approved labeling occurs in specific areas. The proposed language also addresses the requirement for blood components to avoid cross-contamination. I agree with the proposed language and welcome your thoughts and comments. I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. Members of the public can either type comment to indicate they would like to make a comment or raise their hand. We'll give them a moment. All right, I see no request for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Section 1738.11 relates to compounding and as proposed adds language to assure regulated public understands the need to follow the requirements of RAM licensure related to specific areas. RAM licensure requirements should be specific per the above CDPH or comparable authority like the NRC. The proposed language also references federal requirements to components and documentation requirements related specifically to bacterial endotoxin testing. I agree with the proposed language and welcome your thoughts and comments. Okay, seeing none, I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to make a comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of your screen or simply raise your hand. We'll give you a moment. All right, I see no request for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Section 1738.12 establishes dispensing requirements and provides clarity around labeling requirements. This does not appear to be fully clear to include for outpatient dispensing, so additional language is added. I agree with the proposed language and welcome your thoughts and comments. I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment, please type comment using the Q&A panel or raise your hand. We'll give you a moment. All right, I see no request for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
To the final stretch, everyone. Proposed language 1738-13 adds proposed requirements for repackaging that will apply, making mandatory labeling provisions that are included in the chapter as recommended but not required. So we're making it as required. I agree with the proposed language and welcome your thoughts and comments. I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public would like to comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and send it to all panelists, or simply raise your hand. We'll give you a moment. All right, I see no request for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
As proposed section 1738-14, the requirements for quality assurance, quality control, as referenced to the board's quality assurance requirements, include an existing regulation as well as the requirements established in USP Chapter 1163, and including the requirements for scheduled actions such as recalls. Further, as proposed, the regulation establishes notification requirements for adverse drug reactions, establishes timeframes for review of specified complaints, and specifies that failure to comply with SOPs shall constitute a basis for action. I have reviewed the language and feel it appropriate and welcome members' thoughts and comments. Okay, I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel. If any member of the public wishes to comment, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, or simply raise your hand. We'll give you a moment. All right, I see no request for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'd like to thank everyone for your diligence as we completed our review. The proposed the proposed regulation for new section 1738 will be presented at a future board meeting where we will consider all proposed regulations for all compounding sections together as a group. During our next meeting, our next compounding and enforcement meeting, we will continue the same process with USP Chapter 795 and then on to 797 and USP 800. I anticipate we'll have a very robust discussion on those three sections. After we've completed all of the chapters and the proposed regulations, we will consider taking action and offer a recommendation to the full board for further action. Thank you, Christine and Grace, for your attendance. Any final comments by board members or anyone? Great, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, guys.
We'll move on to a next agenda item 9, review and discussion of enforcement statistics. Attachment 5 includes enforcement statistics reflecting enforcement-related activities between July 1st and December 31st. As indicated in the meeting materials, the board received 1,839 complaints during this period and closed 1,459 investigations. The board secured 3 interim suspension orders, 2 automatic suspension orders, and has been granted 4 Penal Code 23 restriction. Also, as of January 1st, the board had 1,450 field investigations pending. The average days for various stages of the investigation are included in the meeting materials. I'd like to take note that there has been a large increase in the supervisor review time and the second level review time. I believe this is in part due to a vacancy at the supervising inspector level. As a committee, I think we should monitor this for improvement in both areas. It's my hope that as the position is filled and onboarding is complete, we will see improvement on those metrics. Members, do you have any questions or comments on the enforcement statistics? Renee, was that your hand? No? I think we're ready for public comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm opening up the Q&A panel, and if any member of the public would like to comment on this agenda item, please type comment using the field in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, or simply raise your hand. We are displaying instructions, and we'll give you a moment. All right, I see no request for comment. Shall I close the Q&A panel?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Members, before we adjourn for the day, I would like to remind everyone that our next meeting is scheduled for February 15th. This meeting will be conducted in person in Sacramento, and members of the public are welcome to attend either in person or via WebEx. We respectfully request individuals attending in person follow all COVID protocols for Sacramento County. Next item is our adjournment. As we adjourn, I want to thank everyone for their time and participation today. It was an extremely productive meeting. We actually got a lot done with a short amount of time, so I appreciate your preparation and reviewing the materials in advance, and for members of the public for their participation. I look forward to our meeting next month, where we'll consider additional proposed regulations on non-sterile compounding, a hot topic. See you next month. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.